Hello and welcome to part 4 of FRC Team 2168's Introduction to Java Lessons. If you haven't seen lessons 1 through 3, the link to the playlist containing them is in the description below, and I also highly recommend that you watch the review lab videos if you haven't already, just to reinforce the knowledge of those lessons because sometimes programming can be pretty confusing. But all of that aside, let's get into lesson 4. So as always, we will do a brief review of the last class. So we ended up talking about methods, and we made a method in our salary calculator program. We then discussed objects, as well as instance variables and methods and how to use them. We talked about the dot operator, and we learned about the static keyword. So methods with parameters, as a review, they're a lot like functions in math with the f of x notation. So you define a variable in the parameters here, and then when calling the method, a value is input into the parentheses, and within the method body, whenever the variable name is mentioned, it gets replaced with the value that was inputted. Void methods are simply methods that do not return anything, they just perform actions, while methods that return data are methods that do return a value and are evaluated as whatever value they return. You have to make sure to put the data type that's being returned in the method header. For the salary calculator, we had written a program that would calculate the salaries of 3 different coworkers, but the first try, we ended up rewriting a bunch of code, and it was just tedious and not very good. So we then rewrote it using a method, and it was much cleaner and more concise. Review about objects. Objects are custom data types with their own member variables and methods, so they differ from primitive data types in that they can have their own variables and their own methods. They're defined in a class and are used by creating object instances. All instances of an object have the same characteristics, i.e. the same variables and methods, but their instance variables can hold different data. Now, classes are essentially the blueprints of objects. So if you think of an airplane object, the class that it's made in would be like the blueprint that was used to build the airplane. It just sort of defines the variables and the methods that the object has. Instance variables can be used like any other variables, and instance methods can be used like any other methods. Instance variables and methods are accessed using the dot operator, and calling an instance method executes the method body for that instance only. Instances are created using the new operator. So you would do the name of the class, then the name of the instance that you are creating, the new operator, and the name of the class once more. Static variables and methods apply to the entire class rather than to specific instances. When static methods are called, the actions are not carried out for one particular instance, but for the class as a whole. Static methods can only access static variables. When calling a static variable or method, you would use the class name as opposed to using an instance name. Alright, so now we are going to get into writing advanced methods. So let's go back to that date program we made last lesson. Recall that instance variables work like any other variables. This means that date1.day could be set to 0, or date2.month could be set to something like a rubber duck. So far, our setter methods don't do any error checking, and they allow the user to set wrong dates. So let's fix that. Let's open up date.java once more. And we are just going to redo our setter methods. So basically what we want is for our methods to make sure that we never set values that don't make sense. So remember before that I said part of the reason, or I guess in summary, the reason that we use setters is because they give us control. So when we set variables using a method, we can do other things in here. We can control what this value is, and we can change it. So using setters is a lot more flexible than just doing day equals whatever. So we can in fact prevent certain values from being set to our variables. So for set month, we want the month to only be able to be set to month names. So we're going to do one very long conditional statement. Okay, so if the name is, or if the string that was inputted is what we want, then we will set month to that string. But if it's something we don't like, instead we'll do something else. We won't end up setting month. So remember that we need to compare strings. So we need to see if the M is a month name. So if M is December, or if it's November, or if it's October, etc. Think for a second, how do we compare strings? Remember that strings are actually objects, as we now know, so they're different from primitive types. Hopefully you remembered that we use the equals method. So if M dot equals December, and we'll use abbreviations for months to make it easier. If M dot equals December, oops. Okay, if M dot equals December, or M dot equals November, or M dot equals October, or M dot equals September, or M dot equals August. And at October, since this is going to be very long, we'll do a multi-line statement. So we can press enter here, and remember that we want to indent one more level each consecutive line so that it's easier to read and all that. Okay, so or M dot equals August, or M dot equals July, it's easy to mess up the parentheses. Or M dot equals June, or M dot equals May, or M dot equals April, or M dot equals March, or M dot equals February, or m dot equals January. Okay, if all of this is true, we want month to equal m. So month equals m, and then we get rid of this, but we want an else. So if the m is not a month, then we want to warn the user. So let's say invalid value provided for month. Now the day and year are going to be a lot easier because we don't have to do super long conditionals. For the day, we'll just say if d is greater than or equal to 1 and it's less than or equal to 31, then we can set day to d. But otherwise, we would print invalid value provided for day. Then for year, similar thing. But in this case, we'll just say that the year has to be a value between 2000 and 2020. So if y is greater than or equal to 2000 and it's less than or equal to 2020, year can be set to y. Otherwise, we'll have the same print, invalid value provided for year. So now we can use these methods. We did use them last time, but we are going to make a new file and use our new and improved methods on 2 date instances. So let's create a file called lesson4.java. And within this file, we of course need a main method. Then we can create 2 date instances. So date1 is new date, and date2 is new date. Then we'll say date1 dot set month to December, date1 dot set day to 31, and date1 dot set year to 2007. Then we'll do system.out.println date1 and date1 dot write output. then date2 dot set month will be July. Date2 dot set day will be 4. And date2 dot set year will be 1776. So then, once again, we'll do the system.out.println date2 and the date2 dot write output. So once we run this, we will see what the output is. But first, I want you to just think about what the output will be. Make your best guess, and then I will run this. And so we get date 1, which is December 31st, 2007, but for date 2, there appears to be more of a problem. So it says invalid value provided for month and invalid value provided for year. So then it says null for 0. So what is the problem here? First of all, we have an issue with month. We wrote July instead of Joel, so we would need to change that. And as for the year, it's not between 2000 and 2020. So instead, it says that we gave it an invalid value, and then it gives us null and 0. So note that the year is assigned to 0. Java automatically initializes member variables for us. So it does this for object-oriented variables, member variables, but we should always still initialize our variables. So month ends up being assigned to null because if strings are not given values, they are automatically given null as their value, which just means nothing, it's empty, whereas numbers would be given 0. So now we know why we use setters instead of accessing variables directly. Even though the input parameters can take on any value allowed by that data type, we can write our methods to ensure the proper data is provided. However, we still can access our member variables directly in other files. This means that we can simply ignore setters. We will now see how to prevent this from happening, and in the process, we will come to understand why we use getters. The private keyword. So we've seen the public keyword a lot so far, and we've established that it controls access to member variables and methods. As I said, it means that we can use variables and methods in other files. So it's what allows us to do what we've done by using date instances and changing their variables and using their methods. So for example, when we use the dot operator on one of our instances, we see the following. It's a list of all of our public member variables, some methods we wrote, and some methods we didn't write as well. So it's because our member variables are public that the user can still do date1.month is whatever I want, date2.day is 2000, and date2.year is -26. They can just not use the setters. Because the member variables are public, the user has direct access to them and can bypass our error checking inside the method. We can fix this problem by making our member variables private. So now let's go do that in date. Back to date.java, we are going to change these variables to private. Now, lesson 3.java is going to have errors because with date 2, we had tried to access these variables directly, but now we can't because they're private. The field date.day is not visible, so this is because it is private. Now, if we just comment this out, the error will go away. And as a side note, if you highlight multiple lines and then do Control / in VS Code, it'll let you comment them all out at once, so that's handy. You can also indent multiple lines at once by just highlighting and pressing Tab, and you can unindent by highlighting and pressing Shift Tab. To uncomment, you would do just Control / again. So lesson 3 should be fine now. Oh, except that I forgot to comment that one out. So it won't pop up as red and bother you, but back to the task at hand. We have a different sort of naming convention for private variables, so we like to put an underscore in front of their names to denote that they are private. So let's do that, and now we'll just have to change every time we use them. We'll have to add an underscore. So I'm just going to do Control F and replace. That was only sort of an issue. I should have done match case. It might just be easier to do it manually. So yeah, adding underscores to the front just allows us to know at a glance that a variable is private. Alright, so now there is no way that Java will ever let the user have direct access to these variables. The only way they can set the data is by using the methods we created. This is called encapsulation, and it's an important part of object-oriented programming. It is convention on our team to begin the names of private variables with underscores, so as I said. More on encapsulation. For now, so now that the member variables are private, when we use the dot operator, we only see the following. So we don't see those variables, we will only see the methods we made. There is no way for the user to bypass our error checking. They must use our setters now. Multiple input parameters. As we've established, we can pass multiple input parameters into one method using a comma. So let's go create a method that will let us set the whole entire date, instead of having to set each part of it individually. So underneath the other setters, let's do public void set date, with the inputs being a string for the month, an int for the day, and another int for the year. Then we'll say month is M, day is D, and year is Y. So now we can set the date all at once by putting in a month name, a day, and a year, and our member variables will be set to all of them using just one method. So then, if we go back to lesson 4, with date2, we can instead just do date2.setDate, July 4th, 1776. And that'll set them all at once. But let's see what happens when we run this. Give a guess as to what will happen. Oh, I did something wrong. Oh. That. Okay. Now, when we run this, let's see what happens. Aha. Date 2 is now July 4th, 1776. But before, it wasn't letting us set these values. Now it's accepting July, and it's also accepting 1776. So convenience means less functionality? So pitfall, bypassing your own methods. What is wrong with the previous code? This method doesn't have any error checking, so the user can still assign incorrect values for a date. So again, you could just set random nonsensical values through this method. Now, we could just re-add all of the error checking into this method, or we could also just call our previous methods in this one. So back to date.java. Instead of doing what we've done, let's say set month to M, set day to D, and set year to Y. So now we are using the methods that have the error checking within this method. So yes, you can use methods within methods. It's the same way that we call methods within the main method. You're just calling these other methods. So if I go back to lesson 4 and I run it again, this time we are back to getting these messages about invalid values. Okay, so let's talk a little more about getters. Now that our member variables are private, we can't use their values in other files by calling them directly. So we wouldn't be able to do system.out.println date1.day. This is what getters are for. They return the values of these variables since we cannot access them directly anymore. Note on the public and private keywords. The class definition always has access to all private and public member variables and methods, so we can use our private variables within the class they are defined in. Public and private only affect what is exposed when we try to use the object in another file. Applying what we've learned so far. Main is a void method. A program in Java always contains a class that has a main method, as we have discussed. So when you give a command to run a Java program, the runtime system invokes the main method. Note that main is a void method, as indicated by its heading, public static void main. It's also public, and it's static because this method is not going to be used by instances, it's used by the file in general. These parameters here might be confusing, or well, it's actually one parameter. This parameter might be confusing. From what I've read, it's just a parameter that takes in a value from the command line. It's not anything we really need to worry about though, but it is an array of strings called args. The println method and strings. We've been using the println method of the system.out object. So system.out is in fact an object. System.out.println is a method. This method takes in a string and it does not return a value. It is a void method. String is also an object and has many methods available, so we've talked about this before too. The ones we've seen so far are .equals and .equals ignore case. More on class definitions. Let's write some more classes using what we've learned so far. So we're going to create a person class, which has a string name, a string born, a date born, and a date died. These are all going to be private, so you would have to use setters and getters. So this is actually an assignment, so it's a bit like the labs. You're going to do it on your own, and then pause the video as you do it, and then once you replay the video, I will do a walkthrough of this assignment. So the assignment is to write methods that will set values of each of these variables, as well as methods that will return the value of each of these variables. So you are to create a person object with a name, a birthday, and a death day, and you will be making setters and getters. So pause the video, try your best to do this, and once you have a solution or are completely stuck, play the video again. Okay, so the solution is here, but I'm going to go into the code and type it out, of course, in just a sec. Alright, so I'm making a file called person.java. So this is a class, but it's defining an object. So I'm not going to have a main method in here because it's not going to do anything in and of itself. It's just defining what a person object is. So we needed to have a string for the name. So private string name. Then a date for the birthday, so that was going to be called born. And then another date died. Okay, so then we need to make setters and getters. So the name one should be pretty easy. We want to do public void set name, and then we'll take in a string called name, and then we'll say name is name, whatever name they put in. Now for the dates, it might be a little more confusing. But remember that objects are just data types. So they can also be a return type. And they can also be a parameter. So public void set born, we would then take in a date born. So then we could do born equals born. The other way to do this is to just do public void set born with the string for the month, the int for the day, and the int for the year, and then create the date here. So that might be a more useful way of doing it. So then you would just do born equals new date, because we have to now instantiate it, or initialize it, sorry. Born is a new date, and then we would just do born dot set day, or set date to month, day, and year. Now you'll notice that it's not giving me errors even though I have two methods of the same name. We will be talking about this later on in a different lesson, but this is called overloading. So you can have multiple methods with the same name as long as the parameters are different. So if I had two set borns, but both of them just took in one date, that would not be allowed, because then when I call it, Java wouldn't know which one I'm trying to call. But since these two method calls would be clearly different, one would have 3 parameters of different types, and this one would have 1 parameter of a date type. Those are different statements, so Java can tell which one I'm trying to use. Hopefully that makes sense. Now we would do the same sort of thing for set died. Public void, because it's not returning anything, set died. You could do a date as the input, and then just say died equals died. Or you could do public void set died string month int day int year. Then initialize died. And set the date using these values. All right, so then we can do the getters, and the getters are rather easy. So public string get name is just going to return name. Public date, the return type is a date. So again, date is just a data type, you can return it. Public date get born. Return born. And public date get died. Return died. All right, so now we should go and try to actually use all of these methods to make sure they work. So if we go back to lesson 4, let's create some people, some persons. First, I'll do person Bob is new person. We'll say Bob dot set name is Bob. Bob dot set born will be January 3rd of 2005. And Bob.set died is going to be February 8th of 2020. Lovely. Okay, so now we want to actually verify that this is working. So we would use some print statements. System.out.println bob.getName. And then we could do some concatenation. The person's name is and then we can print Bob's birthday is, and then be careful here. If you just do bob.getBorn, that's returning a date, but a date can't just be printed. So if I try to run this, this is where most people get stuck who have tried to do this. If you just run this, it's going to give you some weird mix of numbers and letters. Bob's birthday is date at 3830 F1C0. That is not anything. That is printing out the object's location in memory, I believe. Something along those lines. Because a date in and of itself isn't a string. It's not something you can print. So it's just like you want me to print this object, I guess I'll print where it is, what it is to the computer in memory. So that's what that would do. What you want is to get some sort of string from it. So we have write output. So what we could just do is that, and then system.out.println bob.getBorn.write output. So that's kind of two methods in a row. Why is it mad at me? I did not want it to be a Boolean. Oh, I'm silly. Why did I do that? Okay. bob.get. The whole reason I didn't do it in the same statement was because you can't do that. Okay. bob.getBorn.write output. So I just tried to print a void method, which is why it was yelling. Because write output doesn't return anything. This method itself prints something, so you would write it alone on a line rather than using it in an expression. But anyhow, as I was saying, this is two methods in a row, but you can do that. So bob.getBorn, this is giving you a date. So this just evaluates as the birthday date object. So then that's just doing born.write output. So it works. bob.getBorn gives you a date, date.write output writes the output. So we can do this, and it should work the way we want it to. This person's name is Bob. Bob's birthday is January 3rd, 2005. So it works. Now let's see if the other way of setting the birthday works, or the death day. Person programmer is a new person. Then we'll say date, birthday equals new date. Birthday dot set date, we'll do July 19th, 2002. And then we can say programmer dot set name, Kevin. Programmer dot set born. Oops, I don't want that one. Programmer dot set born will be birthday. So now let's do programmer.getBorn.write output and see what happens. So it worked. It now prints July 19th, 2002. So just to review, one way of doing it is to take a date object as an input and then just set this date to that date. So we made a birthday object and then gave it a date, and then we said born within this instance is just equal to that birthday instance I just made in lesson 4.java. Or you could just take in a string, an int, and another int as the parameters, create the date here on its own, and then just set its month, day, and year. Alright, so quick note on files. Reminder, a Java file must be given the same name as the class it contains, with an added .java at the end. So if the file name is date, the class name has to be date as well, and they should begin with a capital letter. For example, another example, a class named car must be in a file named car.java. You will get an error if your class and file name do not match, as it is part of the Java syntax. For now, your program and all the classes it uses should be in the same directory or folder. If they're in different directories, in order to use objects from other files, you would have to do something special, which we haven't learned about yet. That's the end of this lesson. Hopefully, it made sense. Thanks for watching. Have a nice day.